When a military airstrike aimed at terrorist groups results in civilian casualties, the reaction can be immediate and forceful. The United Nations issues statements, human rights officials call for investigations, and global headlines quickly follow. Across Africa and beyond, millions of indigenous people have been driven from their ancestral lands. Entire villages burned. Farmers abandoned fertile fields. Women and children sleep in overcrowded camps. Communities that once lived in peace now survive as refugees in their own countries. Yet, in many of these tragedies, the United Nations was silent. And the suffering of displaced indigenous communities often receives limited international attention. At Kann Media Group right now, we ask a difficult question. Why does the United Nations seem quiet when indigenous communities are uprooted by years of terrorist violence, but speak loudly when governments fighting those same terrorists are accused of harming civilians? Across regions such as the Sahel, the Lake Chad Basin, terrorist and insurgent groups have displaced millions of people. Boko Haram, Islamic State West Africa Province, and other armed factions have attacked villages, destroyed homes, and forced civilians to flee. For those affected, displacement is not a statistic. It is the loss of identity, land, livelihood, and community. The United Nations has a specific mandate to monitor compliance with international humanitarian and human rights law. When credible reports suggest that state militaries may have killed civilians, UN officials often issue public statements because governments are legally bound by treaties and international norms. These statements do not necessarily imply support for terrorist groups. Rather, they reflect the principle that even legitimate counterterrorism operations must protect non-combatants. As Volker Turk recently emphasized, civilians and civilian objects must never be targeted. The UN is more interested in calling out the military when airstrikes targets terrorist hideouts, and in the process, take civilian casualties. The UN usually sees all the displaced people, the farmers forced to pay taxes to terrorist groups. For communities that have suffered repeated attacks by terrorists, international criticism of military operations can feel deeply frustrating. Many ask, where were these urgent statements when our villages were destroyed? Where was the outrage when our families were forced to flee? These concerns reflect a broader tension between two equally important goals: defeating violent extremist groups, protecting civilian lives during military operations. Both objectives are essential, and balancing them is one of the most difficult challenges facing governments and international institutions. International humanitarian law does not prohibit states from fighting terrorism. UN should remember that. The real issue may not be whether the UN cares more about one group than another. The deeper question is whether global institutions communicate effectively enough to reassure affected communities that their suffering is recognized. When displaced indigenous people feel ignored, trust erodes. Terrorist groups have uprooted millions of people across Africa and beyond. Governments have a duty to defeat them, but they also have a duty to protect the innocent. And international institutions have a responsibility to support displaced communities while demanding accountability when civilians are harmed. So what do you think? Is the United Nations applying its principles consistently? Or does its response create the perception of double standards? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you value balanced, fact-based African documentaries and global analysis, subscribe to Kann Media Group, like this video, and turn on notifications. Because every displaced family has a story, and every question deserves to be examined.